I couldn't hear them laughing, but I saw it in the way their shoulders shook and their eyes flicked toward me like I was part of the entertainment they didn't have to pay for, and that was nothing new, not really, because silence had been my world for 26 years and people had always tried to fill it with their assumptions, their pity, or worse, their jokes, but that night felt different the moment I stepped into the ballroom. Like the air itself carried a weight I couldn't explain, heavy. With perfume and power and something colder underneath, something that made the crystal glasses tremble ever so slightly against the white tablecloths when footsteps moved across the polished floor, and even without sound I could tell when he entered because the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with music or voices. It was in the way people straightened, the way conversations paused mid-sentence, the way eyes shifted all at once toward a single point like gravity had suddenly found a new center, and I followed that pull without meaning to, my fingers still wrapped around the stem of a water glass just to feel the faint vibrations of movement around me, and that's when I saw him, tall, composed, dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it looked like it had been built onto him rather than worn, his expression unreadable but his presence unmistakable, like he didn't just walk into rooms. He claimed them without saying a word, and I should have looked away. I usually did when attention drifted too close, but something held me there, maybe curiosity, maybe instinct, maybe the quiet defiance that had grown in me over years of being underestimated, and then someone touched his arm, smiling too wide, gesturing in my direction, and I didn't need to hear the words to understand the setup because I had seen it before in smaller, crueler versions, the glance, the smirk, the expectation of a reaction, and my chest tightened just slightly as he turned toward me, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate, every step measured like he already knew exactly where he was going and why, and suddenly the space between us felt smaller than it should have been, like the entire room had narrowed down to a single path leading him straight to my table, and I kept my posture still, my breathing steady, even as my pulse flickered faster beneath my skin, because I refused to give them what they wanted, whatever that was, and when he finally stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the sharp lines of his face and the faint reflection of chandelier light in his eyes, he said something, his lips moving with calm precision, and I didn't respond, not out of disrespect, not out of fear, but because I couldn't, because I didn't hear the words that everyone else clearly expected me to react to, and for a second, just a second, I saw it, the shift in his expression, the realization forming behind those steady eyes, and everything in the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what he would do next, because whatever this was supposed to be, whatever joke they thought they had set up, it hadn't gone the way they planned, not yet, and something told me it wasn't going to. He did not repeat himself, not right away, and that was the first thing that felt different, because most people, when faced with my silence, rushed to fill it with louder words or exaggerated gestures, but he did neither. He simply watched me for a moment longer, his gaze steady and searching, as if he was recalibrating something in his mind, and then his eyes shifted, not to my face, but slightly past me, to the untouched place setting, to the stillness of my hands, to the way I had not reacted at all, and I saw it happen, that precise second when understanding replaced expectation, when whatever joke had been arranged for his amusement stopped being amusing, and the energy around us shifted again, sharper this time, like a held breath that had nowhere to go, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing by a fraction before he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, the movement controlled, deliberate, drawing more attention than any raised voice could have. Because now everyone was watching, not just me, not just him, but the space between us, waiting for something to break, and instead he typed, his thumbs moving quickly across the screen before he turned the phone toward me, and for the first time since he had walked over, something in my chest loosened as I read the words, simple, direct, no hesitation, no pity, just presence. Hello, I am Adrian, and it was such a small thing, such an ordinary introduction, but it felt louder than anything in the room, louder than laughter I could not hear, louder than whatever expectations had been placed on this moment. And I looked up at him, really looked this time, at the calm in his expression, at the way he did not rush me to respond, and I nodded slightly before reaching for my own phone, my fingers steady even as I felt dozens of eyes pressing in on us from every direction, and I typed back, Lily, and turned the screen toward him, and for a second, just a second, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, subtle enough that anyone not looking directly at him would have missed it, but I did not, because I had spent my life reading the smallest shifts in people. Learning to understand what was never said out loud, and that moment felt real in a way the rest of the room did not, and then he did something no one expected, something that made the tension snap in a completely different direction. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, not halfway, not as if he might leave at any second, but fully, comfortably, like this had been his intention all along. Like the rest of the room had ceased to matter the moment he chose to stay, and the reaction around us was immediate even without sound. I saw it in widened eyes, in stiffened postures, in the way people leaned toward each other, whispering things I did not need to hear to understand, because whatever they had planned, whatever they thought this would be, it had slipped out of their control, and now it belonged to him, and somehow, without saying a single word, without raising his voice or demanding attention, he had taken the joke and turned it into something else entirely. Something quieter, something heavier, something that made it impossible for anyone to look away. He did not look away after sitting down, not even when the weight of the room shifted again, because now it was no longer curiosity that filled the space around us, it was discomfort, the kind that made people adjust their posture and glance toward exits they had no intention of using, and I could feel it even without hearing it, in the way hands tightened around glasses, in the way smiles froze just a little too long, and yet across from me, Adrian remained still, grounded, as if none of that existed, as if the only thing that mattered was the quiet exchange happening between us, and he tapped lightly on the table once, not to get my attention, but to anchor the moment, before lifting his phone again and typing, slower this time, more deliberate, "Do you mind if I stay?" And I blinked at the question because it was unexpected, not the words themselves, but the permission behind them, the absence of assumption, and for a second I hesitated, not because I did not know the answer, but because I was not used to being asked, and I realized then that my hands were resting flat against the table. Fingers slightly curled as if I had been bracing for something that had not come, and I let them relax before typing back, "You are already here," and when I turned the screen toward him, he read it carefully, his eyes moving over each word like they mattered, like I mattered, and that subtle almost smile returned, a fraction deeper this time, before he nodded once, as if acknowledging an agreement neither of us had spoken out loud. And then he did something else that shifted everything again. He set his phone down between us instead of holding onto it, placing it within reach of both of us, an open line rather than a barrier, and I felt something in my chest tighten in a completely different way, not from tension, but from the unfamiliar shape of being met halfway, and for a moment neither of us moved, the stillness stretching just long enough to feel intentional rather than awkward, until I lifted my hand and signed a simple gesture without thinking, a small, automatic habit I had carried since childhood, a greeting that did not need sound, and the second I did it I realized what I had done, my fingers pausing midair as a flicker of uncertainty crossed my mind, because most people did not understand, most people looked confused or uncomfortable or simply ignored it, but Adrian did not look away, he watched, closely, his focus narrowing as if he was committing the movement to memory, and then, slowly, almost carefully, he lifted his own hand and mirrored the motion, not perfectly, not fluidly, but close enough that the meaning landed exactly where it was meant to, and something inside me shifted, something quiet but undeniable, because it was not about accuracy, it was about effort, about the choice to step into my world instead of pulling me into his, and I felt my lips curve before I could stop it, a small smile that I had learned to hide in rooms like this, but this time it stayed, because across from me, the most powerful man in the room had just made himself a beginner, and somehow, that changed everything. The smile did not fade right away, and that alone felt like a small act of rebellion against everything this room expected me to be, because people like me were not supposed to feel comfortable here, not supposed to belong in spaces where every detail whispered wealth and control, and yet across from me, Adrian watched that smile as if it was something worth noticing, not dismissing, not overlooking, and he leaned forward slightly, not enough to invade my space, just enough to show intention. Before reaching for the phone again, his movements slower now, more thoughtful, as if each action carried weight, and when he turned the screen toward me, the words were simple but different from before, "Teach me," and I felt my breath catch, not because of the request itself, but because of what it meant, because no one had ever asked that before, not here, not in a place where people assumed they already knew everything that mattered. And for a second I hesitated, my fingers hovering above the table as I searched his expression for any trace of mockery, any sign that this was still part of whatever game had started all of this, but there was none, only that same steady focus, that same quiet patience, and something in me decided to trust it, just enough, and I lifted my hand again, slower this time, more deliberate, shaping the sign for his name. As best as I could approximate it, breaking it into pieces so he could follow, and he watched closely, his eyes tracking every movement, every shift of my fingers, and then he tried, not perfectly, not smoothly, but with a level of concentration that made the rest of the room feel even further away, and when he finished, he looked at me, not for approval exactly, but for confirmation, and I nodded. A small gesture that seemed to settle something in him, because he repeated it again, refining the motion, improving it in a way that spoke of discipline rather than talent, and I realized then that this was how he moved through the world, not by accident, not by chance, but by intention, by learning and adjusting until he got it right, and the realization shifted something deeper than I expected, because it meant this moment was not temporary to him, it was not something he would forget the second he stood up, and I became aware again of the people around us, the way they were watching. More openly now, less amused, more uncertain, because the scene they had expected had not unfolded, the reaction they had anticipated had not come, and instead of laughter, there was something heavier settling over the room, something quieter and harder to ignore, and Adrian seemed to sense it too, because his posture changed just slightly, not defensive, not aggressive, just aware, his presence expanding in a way that made it clear he had not forgotten where he was or who was watching, and then he did something that shifted the balance one more time. He turned his head, just briefly, his gaze sweeping across the room, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging, and even without hearing it, I felt the ripple that followed, the subtle straightening, the quick glances away, the unspoken understanding that whatever this had been meant to be, it was no longer theirs to control, and when his attention returned to me, it felt different again, more grounded, more certain, as if a decision had been made somewhere beneath the surface, and he lifted his hand once more, repeating the sign I had shown him, slower now, clearer, and this time, when I smiled, I did not try to hide it at all. Because something told me this was only the beginning of a story neither of us had planned, but neither of us was willing to walk away from. The air between us felt different now, not lighter exactly, but clearer, like something invisible had shifted into place and made everything else easier to see, and I realized I was no longer thinking about the people around us, not in the way I had before, because for the first time since I had walked into this room, I did not feel like I was being watched as much as I was being met, and that difference settled somewhere deep in my chest, steady and unfamiliar, as Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, not withdrawing, just giving the moment space to breathe, and then he reached for the phone again, his movements more fluid now, less cautious, as if the hesitation from before had been replaced by something quieter and more certain, and when he turned the screen toward me, the message was longer this time. I did not know they would do this, and I held his gaze for a second after reading it, because the words mattered, but the intention behind them mattered more, and I could see it there, not apology exactly, not guilt, but acknowledgement, the kind that did not try to excuse anything, and I nodded once, a small motion that felt bigger than it looked, because it meant I understood, and more importantly, that I accepted it for what it was, and I typed back carefully, choosing each word, neither did I, and when he read it, something in his expression softened again, just slightly, before he exhaled, slow and controlled, and for a moment we sat there in that shared understanding, two people pulled into the same situation from completely different worlds, neither of us having planned any of it, and yet neither of us stepping away, and then his attention shifted again, not to the room, but to my hands, resting loosely on the table, and he gestured lightly, an unspoken question, and I followed it, lifting my fingers once more, showing him another simple sign, slower this time, guiding the movement with more intention, and he mirrored me again, more confident. Now, his motion still imperfect but steadily improving, and I found myself watching him the way he had watched me earlier, noticing the small details, the focus in his eyes, the way he adjusted without frustration, the patience he did not seem to lose, and it struck me then how rare that was, not just here, but anywhere, because most people did not like being beginners, especially not in front of an audience, and yet he did not seem to care, not about the watching, not about the expectations, only about getting it right, and that realization shifted something deeper inside me, something that had been guarded for a long time, because it meant this was not about proving anything to anyone else, it was about understanding, and I felt my shoulders relax in a way they had not since I arrived, the tension easing without me noticing exactly when it happened, and around us, the room had changed again, the earlier amusement replaced by something quieter, more uncertain. Because whatever they had expected to see, it had not happened, and whatever was happening now did not fit into the shape of a joke anymore, and Adrian seemed to know it, because he did not look away when someone across the room shifted too quickly or when a group leaned closer together, their attention no longer hidden, he simply remained where he was, grounded and steady, as if the space we occupied had become its own world, separate from everything else, and then, without warning, he did something that made my breath pause for just a second. He placed his hand flat on the table, palm up, not reaching, not demanding, just offering, and I looked at it, then at him, understanding the question without needing words, and after a brief hesitation, I placed my hand above his, guiding his fingers into the correct position for the next sign, the contact brief, intentional, and completely different from anything else in the room, because it was not about control or expectation. It was about connection, and as he followed my lead, his focus never breaking, I realized that whatever this had started as, it had already become something no one in this room could take back. His hand did not move away when mine adjusted his fingers, and that stillness carried more weight than any reaction I could have imagined, because it was not hesitation, it was trust, the kind that does not rush ahead or pull back, it simply stays, and I guided his hand through the motion slowly, shaping each position with care, aware of how closely he was paying attention, how his focus never broke even for a second, and when I released his hand, he did not immediately repeat it, instead he looked at me first, as if confirming that he understood not just the movement, but the meaning behind it, and then he tried again on his own, slower, more precise, his fingers adjusting mid-motion as he corrected himself, and I nodded, a small approval that seemed to matter more than it should have, because his shoulders relaxed just slightly afterward, the tension easing in a way that felt almost invisible to anyone else but impossible for me not to notice, and for a moment the world outside our table felt distant, blurred, like something behind glass, because everything here had narrowed down to something simpler, something real, and then I saw it, not from him, but from the edge of the room, a shift that cut through the quiet we had built, someone stepping forward with a smile that did not reach their eyes, their posture too confident, too rehearsed, and even without hearing a single word I understood what was coming, the interruption, the attempt to reclaim whatever narrative had slipped away, and Adrian saw it too. I knew he did because his posture changed, not dramatically, just enough to signal awareness, his shoulders straightening, his gaze sharpening as it lifted from me to the approaching figure, and for the first time since he had sat down, there was something colder in his expression, not directed at me, never at me, but outward, toward the space that had tried to define this moment before it even began, and the person stopped just beside our table, speaking, smiling, gesturing in a way that felt too casual, too forced, and I watched Adrian closely, not the person beside him, because their intentions were already clear, but him, because his response would decide everything that came next, and for a second, just a second, he did nothing, he did not acknowledge them. Did not look up fully, did not break the line of connection that still lingered between us, and that pause stretched long enough to make the moment uncomfortable, visible, undeniable, and then he moved, slow and deliberate, turning his head just enough to meet their gaze, his expression composed but unyielding, and whatever he said, I did not hear it, but I saw it in the way the other person's smile faltered, in the way their posture shifted from confident to uncertain, in the way their eyes flickered briefly toward me and then away again, as if something had been made very clear without needing to be repeated, and when Adrian's attention returned to me, it was steady again, grounded, as if the interruption had only reinforced something rather than broken it, and he reached for the phone once more, typing without hesitation now, before turning the screen toward me. And the words were simple but final in a way I felt more than understood, stay, and I realized then that this was no longer about a moment, or a misunderstanding, or even a choice, it was something else entirely, something that had shifted the balance in a room built on power without raising a single voice, and as I met his gaze, I knew that whatever came next, it would not be controlled by anyone but him, and for the first time, that did not make me uneasy, it made me feel safe. The word stayed with me longer than it should have, simple and direct and impossible to misunderstand, and I realized I was still looking at the screen even after I had read it, as if the meaning might change if I gave it enough time, but it did not. It settled instead, quiet and certain, and when I finally lifted my gaze back to him, Adrian had not moved, his attention steady, his presence unchanged despite everything that had just shifted around us, and I felt it then, not as a thought, but as something physical, the absence of pressure, the absence of expectation, the space to decide for myself, and I nodded once, slow and deliberate, not for him, not for anyone watching, but for me, because staying was no longer about the situation, it was about the choice, and something in his expression eased again when he saw it, not relief exactly, but acknowledgement, as if he had expected nothing less, and for a moment neither of us reached for the phone, the silence between us no longer empty, no longer waiting to be filled, but complete in its own way, and I became aware again of the room beyond our table, not as something pressing in, but as something observing from a distance, because the shift had become undeniable now. The attention no longer hidden behind polite smiles or quiet glances, it was open, direct, and uncertain, and I could see it in the way people held themselves, in the way conversations had slowed or stopped entirely, because whatever this had been meant to be, it had become something else entirely, something no one had prepared for, and Adrian seemed to understand that better than anyone, because he did not react to it, did not acknowledge it, did not give it any space to exist within this moment. Instead he reached for the phone again, his movements calm and unhurried, and when he turned the screen toward me, the words were different this time, more personal. "Do you come here often?" And I almost laughed, not out loud, not in a way anyone else would notice, but inside, because the question was so ordinary it felt extraordinary in this setting, in this moment, in this reality that had been anything but normal just minutes ago, and I typed back without hesitation, "No," and when he read it, the corner of his mouth lifted again, just slightly, before he typed something else. And this time when he showed me the screen, I felt the shift before I even finished reading. "Then I am glad they were wrong tonight," and I held his gaze for a second longer than before, because the meaning behind those words carried something deeper than they appeared to on the surface, something that acknowledged the situation without giving it power, something that reframed everything that had happened without dismissing it. And I realized then that this was not just about what he was doing. It was about how he was choosing to see it, and that choice changed everything, because it meant this moment was no longer defined by the people who had started it, it belonged to us now, and as I looked around the room again, really looked this time, I saw it clearly, the uncertainty, the hesitation, the quiet recognition that something had slipped out of their control, and when my attention returned to Adrian, I found him watching me, not the room, not the reactions, just me, as if the rest of it no longer mattered. And for the first time since I had walked into this place, I felt something I had not expected to feel at all, not just seen, not just understood, but chosen, and that realization settled into me slowly, steady and unshakable, because whatever this night had been meant to be, it had already become something no one else could define, and somehow, without a single word spoken, that was louder than anything I had ever heard. The moment lingered in a way I could not measure, not in seconds or minutes, but in the steady rhythm of something unfolding without force, and I realized I was no longer bracing myself for what might come next, because for the first time that night, nothing felt unpredictable in a threatening way, it felt intentional. And that distinction settled deep enough that I almost forgot where we were until a sudden shift in movement at the edge of the room pulled my attention outward again, a server passing by too quickly, a tray trembling just enough to catch my eye, the faint ripple of motion spreading through nearby tables like a quiet signal, and I followed it instinctively, watching as the balance of the room tried to reset itself, conversations restarting, people attempting to reclaim the atmosphere that had slipped away from them, but it did not quite work, not completely, because something had already changed, something that could not be undone by simply pretending it had not happened, and when I looked back at Adrian, I saw that he understood that too, not because he reacted, but because he did not, his stillness more deliberate now, more defined, as if he had chosen exactly where to place himself in this moment and refused to move from it, and then he reached for the phone again, his movements smooth, practiced, before turning the screen toward me, and this time the words carried a different kind of weight, quieter but more direct. "What do you enjoy?" And I paused, not because the question was difficult, but because it felt unfamiliar in a way I had not expected, not the question itself, but being asked it here, in a place where conversations usually revolved around status, achievements, things that could be measured and displayed, and for a second I looked down at my hands, considering the answer, before typing slowly, choosing honesty over simplicity. Quiet mornings, books, drawing, and when I showed it to him, he read it carefully, his eyes moving across each word with the same attention he had given everything else, and then he nodded once, as if committing it to memory, not as information, but as something that mattered, and he typed again, faster this time, before turning the screen back. "I would like to see your drawings," and the directness of it caught me off guard, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me pause. Because there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a clear statement of interest, and I felt something shift again, subtle but real, as if the distance between this moment and whatever came next had shortened without warning, and I hesitated for just a second before typing back, "Maybe," and when he read it, that same faint curve touched his expression again, not disappointment, not insistence, just acceptance, as if he understood that not everything needed to be immediate to be real. And around us, the room continued its quiet attempt to recover, but it no longer held the same weight, not for me, because whatever had been set in motion at this table had already moved beyond it, beyond the expectations, beyond the intentions of anyone watching, and as Adrian leaned back slightly, his gaze still steady on mine, I realized something that settled into place with quiet certainty. This was no longer a moment that would end when the night did. It was the beginning of something that had already changed the way I saw everything around me, and for the first time in a long time, that did not feel overwhelming, it felt right. The word maybe lingered between us longer than I expected, not as hesitation but as a quiet boundary I had learned to build over time. And Adrian did not push against it, did not try to close the space or rush past it, he simply accepted it, and that acceptance felt louder than any insistence ever could, because it meant he understood something without needing it explained, and I found myself watching him more closely now, noticing the way he held stillness like it was a choice, the way his attention never drifted even when the room around us continued its slow, awkward attempt to return to normal, and it struck me again how different this felt from every other interaction I had ever had in places like this, because nothing about this was performative anymore, nothing about it felt like it was being done for anyone else. And then he reached for the phone again, his movements smooth, unhurried, and when he turned the screen toward me, the question was simple, but it shifted something deeper than the ones before. "Why drawing?" And I paused, my fingers hovering just above the table, because the answer was not complicated, but it was personal, and for a second I considered giving him something easy, something surface level, the kind of response people expected in conversations like this. But then I looked at him, really looked at the steadiness in his gaze, the patience he had shown in every moment so far, and I realized he was not asking for something easy, he was asking for something real. And that realization made the choice for me, and I picked up the phone, typing slowly, carefully, because it lets me hear in my own way, and when I turned the screen toward him, I felt a flicker of vulnerability I had not expected, a quiet awareness of how much that answer revealed without saying too much, and for a second he did not move, his eyes reading the words once, then again, as if making sure he understood them fully, and something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough for me to see it, a subtle shift that carried weight, respect, maybe even something softer, and he nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging not just the words, but what they meant, and then he typed again, and when he showed me the screen, the words were fewer this time, but they landed deeper. "I want to understand that," and I felt my breath pause for just a second, because there was no performance in that statement, no attempt to impress or control, just a simple, honest intention, and I realized then that this was not about curiosity alone, it was about connection, about stepping into a space that was not his and choosing to stay there without trying to change it. And something in me shifted again, a layer I had not realized was still guarded easing just slightly, and I found myself nodding before I had fully decided to, a quiet agreement that felt natural in a way I could not explain. And around us, the room continued to exist, people still watching, still trying to make sense of something that no longer belonged to them, but it felt distant now, like something happening in another place entirely, because everything that mattered had narrowed down to this table, this moment, this exchange that had grown into something far more significant than anyone had intended. and as Adrian leaned forward just slightly again, his attention steady, his presence unwavering, I realized that whatever this night had started as, it had already become something else entirely, something neither of us had planned but neither of us was willing to let go of, and for the first time, I did not wonder how it would end, I wondered where it might lead. His words did not fade after I read them, they stayed, settling somewhere deeper than the surface of the moment, and I realized I was still holding the phone in my hand without moving, as if letting go of it would somehow shift what had just been said, but it did not, the meaning remained steady, and when I looked back up at him, Adrian had not broken eye contact, not even for a second, his gaze calm but intent, as if he was waiting, not for an answer, but for something more subtle, something unspoken, and I felt it then, the quiet weight of being understood without needing to explain further, and it made my chest tighten in a way that was not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, and I nodded slowly, a small motion that carried more agreement than words could have, and something in his expression shifted. Again, softer now, more grounded, as if that simple acknowledgement had confirmed something he already believed, and for a moment we stayed there, suspended in a silence that no longer felt empty, no longer felt like something that needed to be filled, and then the world around us tried again to intrude, more deliberately this time, a figure stepping closer, posture sharper, movements more controlled, and I did not need to hear the words to recognize the intent, it was written in the tension of their shoulders, in the way their gaze flickered between us with something that was no longer amusement, but irritation, and I felt the shift immediately, not as fear, but as awareness, the kind that comes from years of reading situations before they unfold, and Adrian saw it too. I knew he did because his posture changed before the person even reached our table, not dramatically, not aggressively, just enough to signal presence, his shoulders straightening, his gaze sharpening slightly as it moved from me to the approaching figure, and when they stopped beside us, speaking with a confidence that felt forced, gesturing in a way that tried to reclaim attention, Adrian did not respond right away, he let the moment stretch, let the imbalance become visible, undeniable, and then he turned his head, slowly, meeting their gaze with a calm that carried more authority than any raised voice could have, and whatever he said, I did not hear it, but I saw the effect immediately, the way the other person's expression faltered, the way their stance shifted just slightly, as if something had been made clear without needing repetition, and then, just as calmly, Adrian turned back to me, his focus returning as if nothing had interrupted us at all, as if the world outside this table had simply paused and resumed without consequence, and he reached for the phone again, typing with the same steady rhythm as before turning the screen toward me, and the words were simple, but they carried a finality that settled into place without resistance. This is not for them, and I felt something in me respond to that immediately, a quiet recognition that this moment, this connection, had moved beyond the boundaries anyone else had tried to place on it, and I nodded again, more certain this time, because I understood exactly what he meant, and for the first time since the night began, I realized I was no longer thinking about how I appeared, or how this would be seen, or what it meant in the context of everything around us. I was simply here, fully present, fully aware, and when I looked at him again, I saw the same certainty reflected back, and it settled into me with a quiet clarity. That changed everything, because whatever this was, it was no longer fragile, it was something stronger, something chosen, and that made it real in a way nothing else in this room could ever be. The word stayed between us, not as a boundary but as a quiet declaration, and I felt the shift settle fully into place, something steady and unshakable, and for a moment I let myself sit in it, in the clarity of what he meant, in the certainty that whatever this had become no longer belonged to the room or the people watching from the edges, and when I looked up again, I saw that Adrian had not moved, his attention still anchored to me with that same calm intensity, and it struck me then how rare that was, not just here, but anywhere, to be looked at without distraction, without calculation, just presence, and I realized I was no longer aware of the distance between us in the way I had been before, because it no longer felt like distance at all, it felt intentional, chosen, and something in me responded to that without hesitation, without the quiet defenses I usually carried into spaces like this. And then he reached for the phone again, his movements fluid now, almost effortless. And when he turned the screen toward me, the words were different, not a question this time, not an observation, but something that carried weight in a quieter way. I would like to see you again, and I felt my breath pause for just a second, not from surprise, but from the clarity of it, because there was no uncertainty in the statement, no attempt to soften it or frame it as anything less than what it was, and I looked at him. Really looked this time, searching for any sign that this was still part of something temporary, something tied to the night or the situation, but there was none, only that same steady focus, that same quiet certainty, and I realized then that this moment had already moved beyond everything that had started it, beyond the expectations, beyond the boundaries of this room, and that realization settled into me with a calm I did not expect, because instead of feeling overwhelming, it felt simple, clear, like a path that had already been chosen. Without needing to be forced, and I picked up the phone, my fingers steady as I typed, maybe, and for a second I watched his reaction, the subtle shift in his expression as he read it, not disappointment, not doubt, but something closer to understanding, as if he recognized the meaning behind the word, not hesitation, but honesty, and he nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if accepting it exactly as it was, without pushing for more, and that, more than anything else, made something in my chest ease in a way I could not explain, because it meant I did not have to rush, did not have to decide everything in a single moment, and he understood that without needing it said, and around us, the room had grown quieter in a way that felt different from before, not tense, not uncertain, but aware, as if something had been witnessed that could not be undone, and I saw it in the way people no longer tried to hide their attention, in the way conversations had softened, in the way the energy had shifted from curiosity to something more contemplative, and Adrian seemed to recognize it too, because he leaned back slightly, not withdrawing, just creating space, as if allowing the moment to settle naturally, and then he did something that felt almost understated compared to everything else. He reached into his jacket and placed a small card on the table between us, sliding it forward just enough for me to see. And I looked at it, then back at him, understanding the gesture without needing explanation, and when I picked it up, I felt the weight of it, not in my hand, but in what it represented, and as I met his gaze again, I realized that whatever came next, whatever this would become, it had already begun in a way that neither of us could take back, and for the first time, that did not feel uncertain, it felt inevitable. The card rested in my hand longer than it should have, not because I did not understand what it was, but because I understood exactly what it meant, and that made it heavier than something so small had any right to be, and I turned it over once, slowly, my fingers tracing the clean edges as if the motion could delay the shift I felt building beneath the surface of everything, because up until this moment, everything between us had existed in a contained space, defined by the table, the silence, the shared focus that had cut the rest of the room away, but this extended beyond that, this reached into something that would continue after the lights dimmed and the people left and the night ended, and I realized I was holding more than just a way to contact him, I was holding a choice, and when I lifted my gaze back to Adrian, he was watching me, not impatient, not expectant, just present, as if he understood exactly what that moment represented and was willing to let me take it at my own pace, and something about that steadiness made the decision feel less overwhelming, not because it was smaller, but because it was respected, and I nodded once, not as an answer, but as an acknowledgement that I understood, that I saw what he was offering and what it meant, and he seemed to accept that without needing anything more, his expression remaining calm, grounded, as if the absence of immediate certainty did not change anything for him, and then, without urgency, he reached for the phone again, typing one last message before turning the screen toward me, and the words were simple, but they settled deeper than anything else he had said that night. No matter what you choose, this was real, and I felt something in my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore, because there was no claim in those words, no pressure, just truth, and I held his gaze for a second longer than before, letting that meaning settle fully before I nodded again, slower this time, more certain, because I knew it was true, whatever this had been, whatever it had become, it was real in a way that could not be undone or dismissed, and around us, the room had changed once more, not in tension, not in curiosity, but in quiet acceptance, as if everyone present had witnessed something they could not quite explain but could not ignore either, and for the first time, I did not feel the weight of their attention at all, because it no longer mattered, not in the way it had before. And Adrian seemed to sense that too, because he stood then, not abruptly, not in a way that broke the moment, but with a controlled ease that felt like a natural conclusion rather than an interruption, and he did not reach for me, did not attempt to guide or direct anything, he simply inclined his head slightly, a gesture that felt more respectful than any words could have been, and then he stepped back, creating space without distance, and as I watched him turn and move through the room, the same way he had entered, with quiet authority that shifted everything around him, I realized that nothing about this night had gone the way anyone had planned, and yet somehow, it had become something far more significant than anything they could have imagined, and as my fingers closed around the card in my hand, I understood that whatever came next would not be defined by chance or by anyone else's expectations, it would be defined by choice, mine and his. And that realization settled into me with a clarity that felt both new and inevitable at the same time. I stayed where I was long after he walked away, not because I was unsure, but because something in me needed to understand what had just happened without rushing past it, and I watched the space he left behind more than I watched him go, because the absence felt just as present as everything that had filled it before, and the room slowly began to move again, not in the same way it had earlier, not with the same careless rhythm, but with a quiet awareness that lingered in every glance and every measured step, as if something had shifted that no one quite knew how to name, and I realized then that I was no longer part of the room in the way I had been when I first arrived. I was separate from it, not above it, not below it, just outside of its expectations, and that realization settled into me with a calm I had not expected, because for once, I did not feel like I needed to adjust myself to fit into something that had already decided what I was supposed to be, and my fingers tightened slightly around the card still resting in my hand, grounding me in something tangible as my thoughts moved through everything that had unfolded, the quiet understanding, the patience, the way he had stepped into my world without trying to change it, and I thought about how rare that was, how easily it could have gone differently, how easily I could have been reduced to a moment, a joke, a passing curiosity, and instead, I had been met with something real, something intentional, something that did not need to be loud to be powerful, and I felt a small breath leave me, slow and steady, as I finally stood, the movement deliberate, not rushed, because there was nothing chasing me out of this place anymore, and as I began to walk toward the exit, I noticed the way people looked at me now, not with amusement, not with dismissal, but with something quieter, something closer to respect or maybe understanding, and it did not overwhelm me the way it might have before, because it no longer defined anything about me, it was simply there, passing through, and I stepped outside into the cool night air, the city lights stretching out in front of me, steady and familiar, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the stillness settle around me in a way that felt different from the silence I had always known. This was not absence, it was clarity, and I looked down at the card again, turning it once between my fingers before slipping it carefully into my bag, not as a decision made, not yet, but as something I was not ready to let go of, and as I started walking down the sidewalk, the rhythm of my steps grounding me in the present, I realized something that stayed with me long after the night faded into memory. He did not raise his voice, he did not demand attention, he did not need to prove anything to anyone in that room, and yet, without a single word spoken, he changed the way they saw me, and maybe more importantly, he changed the way I saw myself, not as someone defined by what I could not hear, but as someone who could still be understood, still be chosen, still be met exactly where I was, and that realization stayed with me, quiet and steady, like a truth that did not need to be repeated to be known, because some moments do not echo through sound, they echo through change, and that night, without a single word spoken, everything had changed.